My parents called me ATM and then sued me for $650,000 for good upbringing. Hey everyone, before we jump into this story, I need to ask for a quick favor. Our channel isn't getting as many views, and most people don't even watch until the end. If you enjoy this kind of content, please subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. It's free, and it really helps us keep these stories coming. Thanks for your support. Now let's get into it. Hi Reddit. I was born and raised in Westfield, Indiana, a small town with about 9,000 people, 16 churches, and zero chances for anyone with big dreams. Ever since I was a kid, I knew I didn't fit in with my family. My dad, Harold, was a carpenter, constantly grumbling about how things used to be better before drowning himself in cheap beer. My mom, Linda, worked as a secretary at a dental clinic, spending her days gossiping about coworkers and watching trashy TV shows. My younger sister, Megan, was a professional failure who picked a new passion every year. One year it was photography, the next crypto investing, then yoga for dogs. And my older brother, Derek, was the golden boy until he broke his leg playing football and became addicted to painkillers. And me? I was the odd one out. While my dad wanted me to learn a real trade, and my mom wished I would just be normal, I was the kid who loved books, science, and art. I wasn't interested in football, I didn't care about cars, and I definitely didn't want to spend my life working a dead-end job just to afford a house in the same miserable town. I wanted more. But in Westfield, having ambition was seen as foolish. People there didn't dream, they settled. And my family, they were experts at settling. Son, you need to learn to work with your hands, my dad would tell me, cracking open another beer. No one's going to pay you to sit around thinking all day. Ethan, honey, why don't you go outside and play like the other kids? My mom would say, her eyes glued to the latest episode of The Bold and the Beautiful. By the time I was in high school, I had already decided I was going to leave Westfield, no matter what. I wasn't going to end up like my dad, bitter and tired, or like my mom, living through other people's drama. I had a plan, but before I could escape, something happened. Something that made me question everything I thought I knew about myself, my family, and the town I was so desperate to leave. Ethan had always been invisible to the people around him. While his classmates spent their weekends at football games, roaming the mall, or getting into the usual small-town trouble, he was buried in books, sitting in the back corner of the library long after everyone else had left. He taught himself how to code using old programming books and free online tutorials, fascinated by the idea that a few lines of logic could create something entirely new. He didn't have expensive equipment, just an outdated laptop with a missing key and a cracked screen, but that was all he needed. At 18, while most of his peers were worrying about prom or college applications, Ethan built a simple app. It wasn't flashy, just a basic tool that helped students organize their homework schedules. He didn't expect much from it, but within weeks, it started bringing in about $70 a day from ad revenue. It wasn't a fortune, but for a teenager in a town where minimum wage jobs barely paid that much in a full shift, it felt like he had struck gold. By the time he turned 23, he had already outgrown Westfield in every possible way. While his old classmates were still stuck in town working retail jobs or taking over their family businesses, he had been recruited by one of the top IT companies in Silicon Valley. His salary had skyrocketed to $270,000 a year, an amount so absurdly high that he sometimes found himself staring at his bank account in disbelief. The life he had once dreamed of, freedom, success, an escape from everything that had once held him back, was finally his. But instead of indulging in luxury like some of his colleagues, Ethan found himself doing something he had never planned for. He was supporting his family. His father, whose years of hard labor had taken a toll on his body, needed an expensive back surgery that his insurance barely covered. Ethan paid for it without hesitation, transferring the money before his father even had a chance to refuse. His mother, who had spent years complaining about the fine lines on her face, suddenly found herself with access to every cosmetic procedure she could dream of: new teeth, Botox, laser treatments, all covered without question. And then there was Megan. His younger sister had never been good at following through on anything, but that didn't stop her from trying. Every few months, she had a new passion that she was convinced would make her rich, only for it to fizzle out when the reality of hard work set in. Photography, candle making, custom jewelry, crypto trading. Each idea came with an enthusiastic pitch, a desperate plea for funding, and a long list of expensive supplies. And every time, Ethan paid. At first, he told himself it was temporary, that he was just giving them a little boost until they got back on their feet. But deep down, he knew the truth. His family had always looked at him like he was an outsider. But now, he had become something else entirely. He was their lifeline, the safety net they never had to worry about because they knew no matter what, Ethan would be there to catch them. And for a while, he didn't mind. He had the money, after all, and what was the point of success if not to help the people you were supposed to care about? But the more he gave, the more he started to notice something unsettling. They never said thank you. His father never acknowledged that Ethan's money had covered his surgery, treating his recovery as if it were a natural right rather than a gift. His mother never expressed gratitude for the thousands of dollars spent on her vanity, simply making offhand comments about how she finally looked the way she was supposed to. And Megan, well, Megan never even tried to hide it. Each time one of her business ventures failed, she'd roll her eyes and assure him that the next one would be the big one, as if his money wasn't real, as if it was just another infinite resource she could dip into whenever she pleased. And yet, Ethan kept giving. Because for the first time in his life, his family actually seemed to want him around. Every month, without fail, Ethan transferred money to the family account. He paid the bills before they were even due, covered unexpected repairs on the house, and made sure his mother was driving a newer, safer car instead of the outdated one she constantly complained about. Whenever something broke, he had it fixed. Whenever they needed something, he provided. There was never any hesitation, no moment where he stopped to question whether they deserved it. It was automatic, as natural as breathing. And in return, he received nothing but mockery. His father, who had once prided himself on hard physical labor, would shake his head and grumble every time he saw Ethan working. He sits at his computer and pushes buttons, and he thinks he's working hard. He'd mutter under his breath, sometimes loud enough for Ethan to hear. He said it like it was a joke, but the bitterness in his voice made it clear that he meant every word. To him, real work was something you did with your hands, something that left you exhausted at the end of the day. Sitting in front of a screen, no matter how much it paid, was not something he could respect. Megan was worse. She had long since given up on any real ambitions of her own, bouncing from one failed business idea to another, always supported by Ethan's money. And yet, she had no problem ridiculing him whenever the opportunity arose. He should get a Tinder girlfriend, she'd laugh, scrolling through her phone as if he wasn't even in the room. I mean, seriously, what's the point of making all that money if you're just going to sit at home like a loser? She said it with a smirk, her voice dripping with amusement, but underneath it, there was something else, something sharper. His mother, who had benefited the most from his generosity, never openly insulted him, but her indifference was perhaps the worst of all. Whenever someone brought up Ethan's success, she would sigh and wave a hand dismissively. Well, the main thing is that the money is coming in, she'd say, as if that was all that mattered, as if he were nothing more than a bank account with legs. Ethan saw it all. He wasn't blind. He knew the way they spoke about him when they thought he wasn't listening. He noticed how his father barely acknowledged him, how his sister only called when she needed something, how his mother never once asked if he was happy. And yet, he convinced himself that it wasn't as bad as it seemed, that they were just like that this was normal. So he laughed along with them. He brushed off his father's comments, pretending they didn't sting. He forced a smile when Megan made fun of him, acting like it was all in good fun. He ignored the emptiness in his mother's voice, telling himself that she just didn't know how to express love properly. He played the role they expected him to play, pretending not to notice how hollow it all felt. But deep down, every word cut him to the bone. After weeks of working late nights on a particularly difficult project, Ethan finally had a rare evening to himself. Instead of spending it alone in his apartment, exhausted and staring at another screen, he decided to do something different. He wanted to see his family, to remind himself why he worked so hard in the first place. Maybe he had been overthinking things lately. Maybe they weren't as ungrateful as they sometimes seemed. On a whim, he stopped by their favorite Italian restaurant and picked up their usual order, the homemade pasta his mother always raved about, the garlic bread his father claimed no one else could make right, and Megan's favorite truffle risotto. It wasn't about the money. He knew they could have easily ordered it themselves if they had wanted to, but that wasn't the point. He wanted to do something thoughtful, something that might bring them all together, even if just for one evening. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed the kitchen window was open, the warm glow of the house spilling out into the night. Just as he stepped out of the car, he heard laughter, his sister's sharp, familiar giggle, followed by his father's deep chuckle. He smiled for a moment, feeling a strange sense of comfort at the sound of them joking around inside. But then he heard what they were saying. Does the fool think his money gives him weight in the family? Megan's voice was light, amused, as if the very idea was ridiculous. It's just our ATM with Wi-Fi, his father added, his voice dripping with casual cruelty. Ethan felt his stomach drop, the warmth of the moment vanishing in an instant. Well, his mother sighed, as if she were tired of even pretending to care. Let him at least throw some of it at Megan's car, and then we can cut back on the flattery. Ethan didn't move. He stood frozen in place, gripping the bag of food as the words echoed in his mind. They weren't joking. There was no affection in their voices, no hint that they were just teasing. This wasn't playful banter. This was how they really saw him. For 9 years, he had been paying their bills, making sure they never struggled, covering every expense they threw at him without hesitation. And yet, they didn't even respect him. He wasn't their son, their brother, or even a person to them. He was nothing more than a walking wallet, an endless source of money that they had convinced themselves would never run out. The weight of it all hit him at once. The dismissive way his father spoke about his job, the way Megan mocked him every chance she got, the way his mother only seemed interested in him when she needed something. He had ignored it for years, convinced himself that deep down, they still cared. But now, standing there outside the home he had been supporting for nearly a decade, he realized the truth. They didn't love him. They loved what he could give them. Ethan didn't walk inside. He didn't knock, didn't call out, didn't say a single word. Instead, he set the bags of food neatly by the door, took out his phone, snapped a photo, and turned back to his car. He didn't know why he took the picture. Maybe as proof that, despite everything, he had still tried. That even after hearing the way they talked about him, a part of him had still wanted to believe they deserved kindness. As he drove away, the voices kept replaying in his mind, each word carving deeper into the realization he had been avoiding for years. They didn't care about him, not as a son, not as a brother, not even as a person. He was just a paycheck to them, a convenience, a safety net they never had to think twice about, because he had always been there to catch them. His father's insults, Megan's mockery, his mother's indifference, it all made sense now. They had never respected him, never appreciated anything he did, because they had never once seen him as anything more than a resource. And that was enough to change everything. Without even thinking about where he was going, he found himself pulling off the main road and heading toward the lake on the outskirts of town. It was a place he used to go to as a teenager when he needed space, when the house had felt too small, too suffocating, too full of people who never really saw him. He parked the car, turned off the engine, and for the first time in years, he let himself sit in complete silence. Then, without hesitation, he reached for his laptop. He connected to his bank, his fingers moving faster than his thoughts, driven by something deeper than anger. He opened the joint account he had been depositing money into every month, the one his family had used freely without a second thought, and without pausing, he closed it. The confirmation popped up on the screen, asking him to verify. His hands were steady as he clicked confirm. It was done. One by one, he blocked every card that had been paying their expenses. His father's gas, his mother's salon visits, Megan's endless spending. Everything stopped in an instant. He changed every password, removed his mother's email from his accounts, unsubscribed them from the family phone plan. He cut them off completely, with the same efficiency he had once used to keep their lives running smoothly. The game was over. For the first time in years, he wasn't paying for them. He wasn't responsible for them. He wasn't their safety net, their backup plan, their personal bank. He was free. And as he sat there by the lake, staring at the dark water rippling under the night sky, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. The first 3 days were pure chaos. His phone never stopped ringing, the notifications piling up faster than he could clear them. First, it was the missed calls, then the voicemails, then the desperate text messages flooding in one after another. His mother was the first to reach out, her voice carefully controlled, trying to sound casual. "Honey, is something wrong with your bank? I tried to get groceries, but my card isn't working. Maybe there's been some mistake." An hour later, Megan sent a series of frantic texts, her usual smugness replaced with desperation. "Ethan, I can't pay rent. My landlord's threatening to charge late fees. You won't abandon your sister, will you?" His father, as predictable as ever, didn't bother with pleasantries. His voicemail was short and to the point, spoken in the same irritated tone he used whenever he felt inconvenienced. "Son, don't act like an idiot. We need the money." Ethan listened to each message, read every text, then did the one thing he had never done before. He ignored them. He didn't respond, didn't explain, didn't give them the reaction they were expecting. He let their words sit there, unanswered, watching as the texts became more aggressive, the voicemails angrier, the calls more frequent. They weren't worried about him. They weren't asking if he was okay. They were panicking because, for the first time in years, they couldn't reach into his bank account and take whatever they wanted. By the fourth day, his mother escalated. Unable to get through to him, she did what she always did when she couldn't control a situation. She tried to manipulate someone else into fixing it for her. She called his boss. Ethan found out when his manager pulled him aside after a morning meeting, a concerned expression on his face. "Hey, just wanted to check in," he said carefully. "Your mom called the office, said there was some kind of family emergency." She sounded upset. Ethan sighed, already knowing exactly how the conversation had gone. His mother, with her usual mix of dramatics and carefully chosen words, had probably painted some vague picture of a crisis, hoping to guilt someone into putting pressure on him. It wasn't the first time she had used this tactic, but it was the first time it had no effect. His boss wasn't stupid. He had been in the corporate world long enough to recognize manipulation when he saw it. Is there actually an emergency, or is this just family stuff? Ethan shook his head. There's no emergency, just family stuff. His boss nodded, as if that was all he needed to hear. Figured. I told her to reach out to you directly and left it at that. He hesitated for a moment before adding, You good? For the first time in a long time, Ethan actually meant it when he said, Yeah, I'm good. A week passed. The messages slowed down. The voicemails became less frequent. His mother, realizing she wasn't getting anywhere, fell silent. Megan, with no one left to fund her lifestyle, stopped trying. Even his father, who had always been the most persistent, finally seemed to give up. And then, one evening, there was a knock at the door. Ethan didn't need to check the peephole to know who it was. His father had come to collect what he thought was his. Ethan opened the door, already bracing himself for what was coming. His father stood on the other side, fists clenched at his sides, face red with barely contained fury. The moment their eyes met, Harold didn't waste a second before launching into his tirade. What the hell are you doing? He demanded, his voice sharp, his tone filled with the kind of entitlement that had been ingrained in him for years. Ethan met his glare without flinching. I stopped being an ATM, he said simply, his voice calm, almost indifferent. His father's expression darkened, his anger boiling over as he took a step forward. You can't just leave your family. We're your parents. Ethan didn't so much as blink. Real parents respect their children, not mock them. That was all it took for Harold to explode. He started yelling, his voice growing louder with every sentence, his words laced with resentment. He ranted about loyalty, about how a family was supposed to stick together no matter what. He accused Ethan of being ungrateful, of turning his back on the people who had raised him. He sneered that all his money had gone to his head, that success had made him arrogant. But Ethan just stood there. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He let his father unleash every ounce of anger, let him spill out every excuse, every desperate attempt to guilt him back into submission. And when Harold finally paused, breathless with rage, Ethan spoke. Name one thing you've done for me in the last 10 years. The silence that followed was deafening. His father opened his mouth, then closed it. His expression shifted, first anger, then confusion, then something that almost looked like realization. But he had no answer. There was nothing he could say, because the truth was standing right in front of him. For 10 years, Ethan had given them everything. And in return, they had given him nothing. Harold's jaw tightened, his pride refusing to let him admit the truth. Without another word, he turned, walked down the hallway, and left. Ethan closed the door behind him, exhaling slowly. For the first time in his life, he truly felt free. The first month was strange. Hard in some ways, liberating in others. Ethan had spent so many years being needed, if only for his money, that cutting himself off felt almost unnatural. There were no more late-night calls, no frantic demands for help, no endless transactions draining his account. The silence was unsettling at first, but slowly, it became something else. Peace. For the first time in his life, he had no obligations tying him down. No one waiting for him to fix their problems. No one expecting him to put their needs before his own. He could do whatever he wanted. So he did. He picked up new hobbies, things he had always been curious about, but never had the time for. He started running in the mornings, cooking real meals instead of grabbing whatever was convenient, learning a new language just for the fun of it. He met new people, not out of necessity, but because he wanted to. People who didn't see him as a bank account, who valued him for who he was, not what he could provide. Slowly, piece by piece, he was building a life that was entirely his own. Then, a few months later, the news came. His father had tried to start a business. A construction company, apparently, though Ethan had no idea where he got the idea that he could run one. He took out loans, promising investors big returns. He hired workers, landed a few small contracts, and for a brief moment, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, he had finally figured out how to take care of himself. Then everything collapsed. Clients backed out. Payments didn't come through. Lawsuits were filed over unfinished projects and unpaid wages. The loans piled up, and with no money left to cover them, Harold was left drowning in debt. And then came the final blow, charges of fraud. Apparently, in a desperate attempt to keep things afloat, his father had falsified financial documents, taken money under false pretenses, and eventually, it all caught up with him. The trial had been quick, the sentencing even quicker. Harold Matthews, The man who had mocked Ethan for years was now sitting in a prison cell. Ethan had no idea about any of it until, exactly 1 year after cutting ties, he received a letter from his mother. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, like she had written it in a hurry. "Please, son, we have lost everything. The house was taken away. Megan had to move back in with me. Your father is in prison. We have no one to turn to." At the bottom of the letter was a link to a GoFundMe page. They were asking for $120,000. Ethan stared at the number, his mind blank. Even after everything, after the insults, the mockery, the years of being used, when their world fell apart, they still came to him. Not with an apology, not with any acknowledgement of how they had treated him. Just another demand, another expectation that he would clean up the mess they had made. He let the letter sit on his desk for a full day before he finally picked it up again. Then, without a second thought, he dropped it into the trash. They had no one to turn to? Maybe they should have thought about that before they threw away the only person who had ever truly been there for them. Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the GoFundMe page on his screen. The number, $120,000, was bold and unmissable, a plea for salvation from the same people who had once laughed at the idea of him being anything more than their personal ATM. He expected to feel something. Anger, maybe. Bitterness. Satisfaction at seeing them finally face the consequences of their own choices. But as he sat there, rereading his mother's letter, scrolling through the pitiful description on the fundraiser, he realized the truth. He felt nothing. No pity. No hatred. No lingering attachment. Just nothing. They had drained him for years, taken everything he had given them without gratitude, without respect, without a second thought. They had used him, belittled him, dismissed him, until the moment they had nothing left. And now, when their world had crumbled, when they were drowning, they turned to him, expecting him to throw them a lifeline as if nothing had ever happened. It wasn't even surprising. He clicked into his email, typed out a short message, and read it once before sending. "I don't owe you anything anymore." That was it. No explanation. No argument. No anger. Just the truth. He pressed send. Then, without hesitation, he closed the browser, deleted the email thread, and shut his laptop. For the first time in his life, he was truly, completely free. Ethan moved forward without ever looking back. A year after cutting ties, he no longer thought about the people who had once drained him of everything. His time, his money, his energy. His life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. Instead of working himself to exhaustion for people who never appreciated him, he poured his efforts into something that truly mattered. He launched his own startup, building a company that reflected his vision, his creativity, and his ambition. It wasn't easy, but for the first time, every challenge felt like his own to face, not something he was forced to handle for others. The long nights, the stress, the risks, none of it scared him because, for once, he was doing it for himself. And he wasn't alone. His life was no longer filled with people who only cared about his bank account. His friends were real, people who stood by him not because of what he could provide, but because of who he was. He found companionship in those who shared his passion, his interests, and his values. And love. He had met someone who saw him, not his money, not his success, but him. A woman who didn't ask for anything except his time, who appreciated him for who he was rather than what he could give. With her, he never had to wonder if he was being used. He never had to second-guess every act of kindness. He had spent years being surrounded by people who took him for granted, but now, for the first time, he was with someone who truly valued him. As for his family, they had learned an important lesson, though not in the way they had hoped. If you don't respect a person, don't count on their help. Ethan had given them nearly a decade of his life, and when he finally walked away, they had nothing left. The house was gone. Megan had no choice but to return to their mother, both of them scrambling to survive without the steady stream of money they had once relied on. His father, once so proud, once so dismissive of Ethan's success, sat in a prison cell, a consequence of his own greed and arrogance. They had lost everything. And for the first time, Ethan finally understood what it meant to have everything. A life of his own. A future that was his to shape. Freedom. Ethan had finally found peace. His days were no longer filled with constant demands for money, guilt trips disguised as family obligations, or the sting of his father's belittling remarks. He woke up each morning knowing that his success was his own, that his time belonged to him, and that the people in his life now were there because they cared, not because they needed something. But just when he thought his past was behind him, it came crashing back in the most absurd way imaginable. One morning, as he was sipping his coffee and going through emails, a knock at the door interrupted his quiet routine. When he opened it, he was met with a man in a suit holding a large envelope. The moment he saw the official-looking papers, he already knew. Trouble had found him again. He took the envelope, thanked the man out of habit, and closed the door. Sitting down at his kitchen table, he tore it open, his eyes scanning the words printed in bold across the top of the document. Subpoena. His stomach tightened. He read the first few lines, then stopped, blinked, and read them again. His parents were suing him. The lawsuit was so outrageous, so brazen, that he found himself reading it over and over, unable to process the sheer audacity of it. They were demanding $650,000, claiming it as an investment in their lives, money they insisted he owed them for everything they had done for him. He let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. For years, they had drained him financially, treating his generosity as their birthright. When he finally walked away, they had lost everything. And now, instead of accepting responsibility for their own failures, they were trying to legally force him to continue supporting them. He wasted no time calling his lawyer. "Is this a joke?" he asked the moment the call connected. "No," his lawyer replied with a sigh. "It's blackmail." That was exactly what it felt like. A desperate attempt to squeeze money out of him. One final, pathetic scheme now that all their other options had run out. And as if the lawsuit wasn't ridiculous enough, his mother had taken it a step further. A few hours later, Ethan's phone buzzed with messages from friends, all linking him to a video that had gone viral on Facebook. He clicked the link, already knowing what to expect. There, in a dimly lit room, sat his mother, tears streaming down her face, her voice trembling as she spoke directly to the camera. "My son abandoned us in our time of need," she cried. "After everything we did for him, after raising him, supporting him, giving him a home, he turned his back on his own family. And now, we have nothing." She paused dramatically, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue before continuing. "We're not asking for much, just for him to do the right thing." Ethan clenched his jaw, feeling a familiar mix of frustration and exhaustion. They weren't just trying to take his money. They were trying to turn the world against him. But if they thought he was going to fold under pressure, they were about to be very, very disappointed. The courtroom was tense from the moment Ethan stepped inside. He had prepared himself for the worst, knowing his parents would do everything in their power to manipulate the system. But at first, the judge seemed fair, listening to both sides with an expression that gave nothing away. His parents' lawyers painted him as an ungrateful son, a selfish man who had abandoned the very people who raised him. They twisted the narrative, making it seem as though Ethan had built his success on their sacrifices, conveniently ignoring the fact that for nearly a decade, he had been the one supporting them entirely. Ethan's lawyer countered with cold, hard facts, bank statements, transaction records, proof of every expense he had covered, every bill he had paid. They showed that he had not abandoned anyone, but rather had been used until he finally had enough. It should have been an open and shut case. And then, something changed. It was subtle at first. The judge's questions became sharper, directed more at Ethan than at his parents. The scrutiny in his gaze no longer felt impartial, the tone of his voice carrying something that hadn't been there before. Ethan felt it immediately. Then his lawyer, who had been confident and precise in every meeting leading up to this, suddenly became hesitant. His arguments lost their strength, his words faltered, and he let accusations slide that he should have immediately objected to. It was as if something had shifted behind the scenes, something Ethan couldn't quite see, but could definitely feel. And then the ruling came down. The judge partially upheld his parents' claim, declaring that Ethan owed them a staggering $450,000. He lost. The courtroom fell silent for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His parents exchanged glances, his mother covering her mouth in a poor attempt to feign emotion, while Megan, sitting beside her, barely concealed her smug satisfaction. But something wasn't right. Ethan had walked into that courtroom prepared for a fight, but not for this. The way the judge had shifted, the way his own lawyer had gone quiet, the way the entire case had been tilted against him at the last second, it didn't make sense. As he left the courthouse, his mind raced. He had lost, but something told him this battle wasn't over yet. Ethan refused to accept defeat. Something about the trial had been off from the start, and now that the dust had settled, his instincts told him there was more to uncover. He had spent years being manipulated by his family, and if there was one thing he had learned, it was that they would do anything to get what they wanted. So he started digging. Through contacts in the legal field, he quietly looked into his own lawyer, the man who had stood by him confidently before the trial, only to freeze up when it mattered most. What he found was exactly what he suspected. Shortly before the case went to court, a large sum of money had been deposited into his lawyer's account. The source was carefully hidden behind a maze of transactions, but it didn't take long to trace it back to one of his father's old business associates. Ethan clenched his jaw. His own lawyer had sold him out. But that wasn't all. The judge had been the real problem in that courtroom. From the moment the trial shifted, Ethan had felt it. The bias, the sudden hostility, the verdict that made no sense given the evidence. If his parents had been desperate enough to bribe his lawyer, what were the chances they had gone even further? He hired a private investigator. Weeks passed as the detective followed leads, searching for anything that could prove corruption. And then, the breakthrough came. The judge had received $50,000 through an offshore account, one linked directly to a known associate of Ethan's parents. But the real smoking gun? A security camera recording from a restaurant showed his mother sitting across from the judge exactly 1 week before the trial. Ethan stared at the footage, watching as his mother leaned in, her face full of forced concern, while the judge nodded, his expression unreadable. There was no audio, but the body language told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't justice. It had been a setup from the very beginning. His own family had bribed the legal system, manipulated the court, and framed it as if he was the one at fault. Ethan sat back, exhaling slowly. They thought they had won. They thought they had broken him. But this fight was just getting started. Ethan had spent years allowing his family to walk all over him, using him, mocking him, and discarding him the moment he was no longer useful. But this time, they had gone too far. This wasn't just emotional manipulation or financial abuse. This was a crime. And he wasn't going to let them get away with it. He hired the best law firm in town, a team known for their ruthlessness in corporate fraud cases. They weren't just expensive, they were the kind of lawyers who didn't lose. Ethan gave them everything: the bank records, the offshore transactions, the restaurant footage, the proof that his own lawyer had been bribed. Every single piece of corruption was laid out in black and white. For 4 months, his legal team built the case meticulously, preparing for absolute destruction. And then, they filed a double lawsuit. One against his parents, one against the judge. The charges were brutal: conspiracy to defraud, financial racketeering, attempted bribery of a court. This was no longer just a civil matter. The case was transferred to the FBI. His parents, who had spent years manipulating everyone around them, could no longer play the victims. They had turned to the legal system thinking they could cheat their way into stealing from him one last time. Now, instead of collecting money, they were facing federal charges. Ethan had spent his life cleaning up their messes. But this time, he was the one burying them. The courtroom was filled with tense silence as Ethan sat beside his legal team, watching his parents put on their usual performance. His mother clutched a tissue, dabbing at imaginary tears, while his father sat stiffly, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Their lawyer, who had spent months trying to manipulate the narrative in their favor, still carried himself with confidence, as if he truly believed they could escape the consequences of their actions. Then the doors burst open, and everything changed. A team of federal officers stormed into the courtroom, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from tense to chaotic. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people turned in their seats, whispering in shock as the officers moved with purpose. The lead investigator stepped forward, his voice steady and authoritative, cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "Judge Alan Crawford, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice." The judge's face drained of color as the officers closed in on him. His hands, which had once delivered a corrupt ruling against Ethan, now trembled as he was forced to stand. His mother let out a sharp, theatrical gasp, clutching her chest as if she were about to faint, while his father sat frozen in his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly that Ethan wondered if he was physically stopping himself from reacting. But the real moment of betrayal was still to come. Faced with the undeniable reality of his arrest, the judge did exactly what Ethan's legal team had anticipated. He turned on his co-conspirators without hesitation. To secure a lighter sentence, he confessed everything. He admitted to the bribe, the offshore account, and the secret meeting with Linda Matthews. He exposed the entire scheme, laying out in full detail how Ethan's parents had manipulated the legal system in an attempt to steal from their own son. Ethan's mother sobbed, her face buried in her hands as the courtroom cameras captured every second of her disgrace. His father remained silent, his entire body rigid with fury, his fingers digging into the wooden table in front of him. The lawyer who had stood so confidently at their side now looked pale, his eyes darting between the officers and his clients, as if realizing too late that he had backed the wrong side. By the time Ethan stepped out of the courthouse, the story had already begun spreading. Headlines flashed across news sites, social media exploded with outrage, and reporters scrambled for statements. Family scam. Parents attempt to swindle son out of hundreds of thousands of dollars by bribing judge. The court reconvened days later, but the outcome had already been decided. The deception was undeniable, the corruption fully exposed. There was no more debate, no more theatrics, no more desperate attempts to paint Ethan as the villain. The ruling was swift. Ethan was found not guilty. His parents had spent years controlling him, exploiting him, and believing they could manipulate him forever. They had tried to use the legal system to trap him, only to find themselves caught in a trap of their own making. As the final verdict was read, Ethan didn't smile, didn't react, didn't feel any satisfaction. He simply stood up, walked out of the courtroom, and left them behind for good. They had destroyed themselves. The sentencing was final, and there was no room left for debate. The courtroom, once filled with manipulations, false tears, and desperate attempts to twist reality, was now silent as the judge delivered the punishment. 7 years in prison for fraud, conspiracy, and bribery. It was a number that carried the weight of every lie, every stolen dollar, and every failed scheme they had tried to pull. Ethan watched his mother gasp as if someone had physically struck her, clutching her chest in dramatic disbelief, as though she hadn't spent years orchestrating lies to drain him of everything he had worked for. She shook her head, her voice trembling as she tried to plead with the judge, with the officers, with anyone who might listen. Even now, even in the face of undeniable justice, she refused to take responsibility, wrapping herself in the same victim narrative she had always used as a shield. His father remained silent. He stood tall, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. There was no anger, no protests, no pleading, just a cold acceptance of the reality he had helped create. Perhaps he had finally realized that all the lectures about hard work and family loyalty had been nothing more than hypocritical noise when it came to his own actions. Or perhaps he knew that no words would change what was about to happen. Either way, he did not fight it. Megan had tried to distance herself from the fallout, but it was too late. She had spent years spending money that wasn't hers, jumping from one failed idea to another, always assuming there would be another safety net beneath her. But there wasn't. With her parents behind bars, there was no one left to bail her out. Her credit was destroyed, her reputation was ruined, and all the dreams she had tossed around so carelessly were now completely out of reach. There would be no luxury business, no effortless wealth, no easy success. The money was gone, and she had never learned how to build anything for herself. Ethan sat in the back of the courtroom, watching as the officers approached his parents and secured the cold steel of handcuffs around their wrists. His mother let out another wail, her sobs filling the air as she struggled against the inevitable. His father didn't say a word, and Ethan, for the first time in his life, felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in him. There was no satisfaction, no sense of revenge, no lingering attachment to the people who had shaped so much of his past. They had taken everything they could from him, pushed him to his limits, and when he finally walked away, they had tried to destroy him. But in the end, they had only destroyed themselves. He stood up slowly, slipping his hands into his pockets, taking one last look at them as they were led away. He had spent years trying to prove himself to them, trying to earn their approval, their love, their respect. But now, standing in that courtroom, he finally understood that he had never needed any of it. He turned without another word, stepping through the doors into the bright light of the outside world, breathing in the air of a life that was finally his own. He was free. 3 months passed, and for the first time in his life, Ethan lived without the weight of his family dragging him down. He woke up every morning with no demands, no guilt trips, no endless stream of financial burdens disguised as family obligations. His company was thriving, his friendships were real, and his life finally belonged to him. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. The envelope was marked with the return address of a federal prison. Even before he opened it, he already knew who it was from. He unfolded the paper and read the words written in his mother's familiar handwriting. "Son, please help us. We are your family. We made a mistake. We didn't mean to do this. We just thought you had a duty to us." The excuses bled through every sentence. There was no real apology, no acknowledgement of the years of manipulation, no genuine remorse for what they had done. Just another desperate plea, another attempt to pull him back in, another assumption that no matter what they had done, he would always be there to fix it. He didn't even finish reading. Without a second thought, he crumpled the letter in his hand and tossed it into the trash. He had already spent too much of his life cleaning up their messes. This time, they could live with the consequences on their own. Without another glance, he turned back to his new life, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. Ethan's nightmares were finally over. There were no more desperate calls, no more guilt-laced messages, no more manipulation disguised as love. His days were no longer spent carrying the weight of a family that had only ever seen him as a source of money. He no longer woke up to the stress of wondering what new financial demand would be thrown at him or how they would try to trap him again. The chains they had wrapped around him for years had been broken, and he had never felt lighter. His life was now his own, and for the first time, it was filled with people who truly cared about him. He was with a woman who valued him not for his success or his bank account, but for the person he was. His friends were real, people who respected him, not because of what he could give them, but because of the kind of man he had become. His career was thriving, and every achievement felt meaningful because it was no longer funding the selfish whims of people who had never appreciated him. Most importantly, he had finally understood something that had taken him years to learn. Your real family is not defined by blood or obligation. Your real family is made up of the people who respect you, who stand by you without expecting anything in return, who see you as a person and not a resource. So what do you think? Have you ever dealt with family members who tried to manipulate or take advantage of you? How would you have handled the situation in Ethan's place? Let me know your thoughts.